1. Let me first preface this with a note. This isn't being shared to be analyzed or to have someone pop up and say it was demons, ghosts, or otherwise. I do strongly suspect it was ghosts, but being a skeptic in such things, I can't say for 100% that's exactly accurate. It may have been my child mind interpreting things oddly. Also, the location I will describe does not exist, having been destroyed in a highway widening project sometime between 1990 and 2000. When I was rather young, in 2nd grade in fact, my family lived in the country, out in the middle of nowhere in Mississippi. There were no children for me to play with, and I tended to get a bit more lonely than you'd expect. We were in the process of moving out there. Parents had this double-wide trailer. There was one incident that took many years to be certain I hadn't imagined it. While on one expedition to the plot where my family were going to put the trailer, my mother needed to make a stop to use the restroom. With no gas stations for a good 10 miles, Dad pulled the truck down this dirt road looking for a place to stop. There, maybe 200 to 300 yards from the 2-lane road, we found what looked to be an abandoned gymnasium from a school. Dad decided to use that place as a bathroom, and we headed in. I do not recall much about the building, though one thing always stuck out in my mind. Near the doors we entered through was this rather massive pile, or massive to my child mind, of clothing. I remember after doing his business, my father stood at the foot of it looking up at the clothing. He seemed to be thinking of something, but he never said anything about it. Several weeks later, with the trailer in place, we moved out there and the gym was largely forgotten by me. However, that didn't stop weird things from happening. Well, not weird in the sense of stuff moving around or anything of that sort. Weird sounds. Within a month or so of living there, I was playing on the front porch when I heard laughter. Now, before I go further, let me clarify as to where we lived then. The trailer was a good 100 feet back from a dirt road, and on the road was the home of an elderly gentleman I'll call O. Behind his house was a rather extensive stand of pine trees that reached down to the 2-lane highway, probably a distance of 500 to 600 feet total between where I was and the highway. In any case, as I sat on the front porch my father had built, playing with some of my toys, I kept hearing laughter. Not one child's laughter either, but several. It sounded to my ears like 5 or 6 kids were playing somewhere off behind where O lived. Not having anyone to play with, I remember wondering where those kids were, and if they'd play with me. Walking up to the road, I could tell the kids seemed to be playing in the woods as their laughter came and went. After a moment, I called out to them that I wanted to play too. As soon as I said that, the laughter cut off. Dead, no pun intended, silence. One moment there was laughing and fun, and the next it was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I decided that I'd scared the kids off and went back inside. This happened several times, and eventually I just gave up. I'd hear the kids laughing and playing, but they never seemed to get closer. After a couple times of this, I remember telling my mother, and she got this really odd look on her face before telling me that she didn't want me playing out front any longer. We lived there another year or two before we moved, and I largely forgot the experience. It wasn't until many years later when the story came up again in conversation with my parents. That's when I found some of the story out, and personal investigation told me the rest. My mother said that the reason she reacted that way was because she'd heard the rumor that the area we moved to was haunted. She didn't have all the details, but felt it was tied to the old gym. All she could say, or would say, was that, quote, something bad had happened, and she was afraid. After my parents passed away, I kind of forgot the story again. It always stuck in the back of my head as just something weird, but that's it. Eventually, one bored night I happened to stumble across the website for the church we had attended. On a lark, I shot an email off to the pastor asking if there had been a gym near where I remembered. I didn't expect to hear back. 2 months later, I checked my email to find that yes, he had actually replied. Here's what he related to me. There had been a gym that once stood near where I described, though it had long since been torn down. The gym had been part of a private school which had stood there from roughly 1900 to about 1979 or 80. Early in the spring of that year, a tornado had gone through and demolished most of one wing of the school, in doing so killing a number of students. The building had collapsed, burying the students under the rubble, resulting in the death of a number of them. I think between 10 and 15 students. After this, it was decided to close the school. As they were demolishing it, they cleaned out clothing from lockers and various places, dumping it in the gym in the tall pile I remembered seeing. The gym had been left standing because it was hoped that one of the local churches might use it, but given what happened there, well, it ended up being left abandoned. Curiously, the property behind O's house had also been part of the school's property at one time, being used by the students as a kind of playground area. This did explain why O kept digging up old toys, mostly metal trucks and such, which he gave to me. Looking back, I've come to the conclusion that what I had been hearing was in some way tied to the old school and the loss of life, though I wonder if in some way it was my childhood imagination running wild. That's probably one of the problems I have with this story. For all I know, my parents could have mentioned what happened at the school at some point, and I overheard it, and in my lonely state my mind and imagination just ran wild. Whatever the case, I thought you'd find this story interesting, to say the least. 2. This was the final experience in that house, but also one of the most terrifying. It had been almost 10 years since we moved in and the activity started. My parents had gotten divorced and remarried just within the last year and a half. My new stepdad and mom had just closed the deal on a new house in the country. I was really excited about living in the country, and equally as excited about getting out of that house. The paranormal activity had diminished to almost nothing, though. It had been over a year since I had anything weird happen to me. I was actually able to be in the house alone. It was just days before we were going to move. I was alone in the house, getting things together in the playroom. There was a wall in that room that if I looked at it, I would see a little flash of light every once in a while. It was like a flashbulb, but not nearly as bright, yellow in color. The flash was always followed by something terrifying. It happened all over the house, but that wall it happened to the most. I was beginning to believe that I was seeing things until a friend of mine saw it with me. Right afterwards, the ceiling thumped like someone had hit it with a hammer. I ran out of there and he followed. He didn't believe me that it happened quite often, and wrote it off as someone being upstairs. There was no upstairs in that room, just another attic. I had avoided looking at that wall for a long time. I believe the time my friend Larry saw it was the last time I looked at that wall. But we were packing up to get out, and nothing weird had happened for a long time. So for some stupid reason, I looked up there. Nothing happened. Great, I thought. Now I was totally relaxed and no longer uneasy about being in the house alone. I started packing up some of my toys and putting them into boxes. I looked down at a G.I. Joe vehicle of mine, and there was one of my G.I. Joes sitting in it facing away from me. As I started walking over to pick the stuff up, I looked up at the wall. I saw the flash, and my heart stopped, it seemed like. I was just catatonic for a few seconds. I closed my eyes and waited for whatever was going to happen. When nothing seemed to happen, I opened my eyes and looked down at my G.I. Joe. His head turned around and looked at me. My heart stopped again. I was even more scared because I had to walk right past it to get out of there. It may not make sense, but I didn't want to go near that thing. So I was scared to be in there and scared to leave. I felt trapped by G.I. Joe. I finally ran out of there and stayed out of the house until the rest of the family got home. I had my older brother throw that particular G.I. Joe in the garbage that night. There was no way I was going to bring it with me to the new house. When I saw the movie Poltergeist at the theater a year or so later when it came out, that part where the clown doll's head turned while the kid was hiding under the covers really scared me, because I had the same thing happen to me. It just brought back the same fear I experienced in the playroom. 3. Okay, so to start out, I'm fairly skeptical of the paranormal, so I don't really know what to believe. But the only stories that are even a little similar to what I experienced all seem to be paranormal. So to give some backstory. My street and neighborhood are pretty quiet, especially at night due to the number of young families and elderly couples that live on my street, which makes staying up into the early hours of the morning more relaxing, and also a bit cooler knowing I'm most likely the only person on my street that's awake. The only thing is that I've had some creepy experiences, like hearing noises or even seeing a few drug deals, but most of that can be chalked up to living next to a big forest with lots of wildlife, or just some sketchy neighbors. But for the past week, I've been trying to find a logical explanation for the strange events that keep occurring. It started at 2 a.m. last Tuesday morning. I was just sitting in bed on my phone with earbuds in, something I do almost every single night, but when I began to hear whistling coming from out my window, I took my earbuds out and began listening to the whistling, trying to come up with an explanation. Normally, I'm not scared by anything in my neighborhood this late, and to be honest, I get more excited that something's happening and I'm there to witness it. But this time felt different. I wanted so badly to get up and look out the window, but I was almost paralyzed with fear. I don't know what came over me, but every minute that went by of this whistling, I felt the pit in my stomach growing larger. It went on for almost an hour. And for the entire hour I waited for the whistling to start a tune or a song I could look up. But it just kept whistling the same note in a strange pattern. It would whistle one note for a good minute, then take a break for 30 seconds, and then return its 1-minute whistle, until about 20 minutes in when the whistles got shorter and closer together, only to return to the original pattern after about 10 minutes. What was even more strange was that whatever it was pacing in front of mine and my neighbor's house, up until it stopped when it retreated back down to the other side of the street. As I heard it leave, I almost immediately felt the pit in my stomach subside, and while I was still confused, I decided to just go to sleep before I scare myself even more. So the next day, I asked my parents and even some of my friends that live close by if they had ever heard anything like that. Everyone assumed it was an animal, which made me feel a lot better, but I wanted a definite answer of what I heard. I stayed up for hours that night researching types of animals that were local to my area and the noises they made. I didn't find anything that matched. This only left me more frustrated that I had no clue what it was, so I continued staying up in the hopes I would hear it again, and that this time I would look out my window to see it. But with my luck, I never heard the whistling again, except lots of other weird things that have been happening. After the whistle, I began hearing someone or something walking around in mine and my neighbor's driveways, and sometimes even yards very late at night. But whenever I go to check, I can't see anything. Then about 2 nights ago, when I swear I saw a figure of a person lurking behind my neighbor's car. Then the night after that, I saw what looked like a flashlight in the woods near my house, and whatever it was that was holding the flashlight was running out of the woods. And again, last night, I swear I saw a person crouching near my neighbor's car, just looking around. I thought I was done researching because I couldn't find anything about any animals. But now I've begun researching any stories even similar to mine, hoping that I'm either not alone or, even better, someone has the answer to the strange occurrences, because I would like to start sleeping at a more normal time again, and not be worried about either a stalker or a poltergeist coming to get me in my sleep. Any insight would be greatly appreciated, or even knowing that at least someone is listening. So yeah, that's about it. 4. For a little backstory. I have never experienced sleep paralysis before in my lifetime. This is my first experience ever with sleep paralysis. I have 3 little girls, 4 years old, 2 years old, and 4 months old. During yesterday afternoon, I had been having battery and CAI, cold air intake, issues with my car, and I needed to work on it to be able to get into work Monday morning. Therefore, my retired grandmother kept the girls overnight to assist me in getting everything I needed to complete for work. Let's start with Saturday. Have you ever heard of the creepy fact that is usually true, that if you wake up in the middle of the night for no reason at all, it means someone was staring at and watching you? This is because it was bred into us as a protective instinct. Our senses were heightened in this moment to protect us from a possible threat that had been eyeing us down while we were asleep. This happened to me Saturday at 3 a.m. As I awoke, I heard an eerie whistling in my ear. I quickly checked my surroundings, bobbing and weaving my eyes through every crevice that whoever or whatever was watching me could be hiding. I found nothing, heard nothing else, and was able to doze back off fairly quickly. Sunday came along last night. I had trouble falling asleep. A lot more than usual, but I was not stressed as some have pointed out. My sleep schedule has not changed more than an extra hour, more or less. I'm used to getting about 6.5 to 7 hours of sleep at night, so nothing was different. I had been tossing and turning from midnight to 1:30 a.m., going in and out of catnap mode. I can't seem to get my brain to have a reasonable reboot. Once I had become comfortable for the last time, I hadn't even noticed I had finally shut down for a sleep restoration. The first thing I remember is my grandmother's house. It had a dark blue tint that blanketed the whole house. Every room, wall, everything was hued in blue. I remember walking through and checking in each room. I guess I was unintentionally checking on my girls that were sleeping over at my grandmother's house. I felt like I was astral projecting. I knew I was consciously awake and walking around her house. I knew each room I was walking into. As to my subconscious worry, I assumed to be a worry that I didn't realize I was feeling, was fine. My grandparents and baby girls were sound asleep, peaceful. I watched them for a couple of minutes, checked their breathing, and started to walk home. In a matter of seconds, I was walking through my door, my husband still asleep on the couch. But something didn't feel right. The ominous blue light was still blanketing over every room, every corner. Imagine putting a blue light bulb in every light fixture, and then turning them all on. I sat on my dining room table to meditate and clear my head before returning back to my body on the couch. I needed my consciousness to stop wandering and rest. As I lay there, I heard a voice that had multiple tones working together in harmony to create the most demonic and ominous voice I've ever heard. I felt my mind and my body and my voice lose control. I could not move. I could not talk. I could not think for myself. He took control. The voices got louder. A female voice and a deep male voice harmonized to create a legion-like sound. They kept repeating, "You are everything, you are everything," until I began to say it in harmony with them. I had no control. My mind didn't want to repeat it, but I had no choice. I felt like I was being possessed. Anyone could take over what felt like the empty shell I used to call my body at this point. What they were saying changed. The woman's voice disappeared, and it was just the deep and demonic male voice I heard now. He said, "I am everything. I am everything." Repeating and repeating. At this point, I felt my body and mind fighting back. I was fully conscious and awake now, fighting as hard as I could to keep my shell of a body contained by its rightful owner. Me. I was screaming my husband's name. I knew he couldn't hear me, not yet. I had to keep screaming to wake my body up. I felt my brain's confusion. It was fighting me while I was fighting the demon. We weren't working together, and I could sense it all. I started to communicate, moving my body. I knew I couldn't. I knew I was caught. My ribs, my hips, my thighs were glued where I lie on my left side, unmovable. I could only move my head. My screams for my husband became muffled, which is more than I could say just moments before. I turned my head and looked behind me. I needed to be released. I had to be let go. As I whipped my head to my rear, a tall and skinny shadow towered over me, enjoying my struggle, gluing me where I lie. Larger and skinny hands that attached to slender, ridged fingers pushed me deeper into my couch, held my body in a trance. There were no features, just a black and haunting silhouette that had been forcing me to say everything I had earlier. He was the one. I was finally able to communicate to my brain to move, anything, just move. Still a fight that I had to put up, but I knew I was winning. Finally, my screams were no longer muffled. My husband finally heard me, and a relief washed over me. It was gone. I was able to sit up, patting myself with my shaking hands to make myself aware that I was back. It was me again, and I finally had control once again. I needed a cigarette to calm my nerves. I felt the smoke hit me and the nicotine soothed my mind. But I still felt and knew the pain, the struggle and torture I went through, and wonder if it will happen again. I don't know who those voices were, who the demon is that calls himself everything. Will he come back for me again, even when I fought back so hard and won? I can't find answers that I need, but I know this wasn't some freak accident. There was a reason this happened, and I need to know. 5. So this happened to me years ago. I think I was like 12. Back then it wasn't strange for kids my age to venture outside in the mountains in groups to explore, hunt for lizards, or just stroll on our bikes. We were all living in the same street, right next to a variety of mountains. The neighborhood was brand new, so much so that many houses were still on sale. There were lots of weird animals on the mountain, big lizards with blue tongues, big bugs, snakes, rabbits. It was super exciting for kids like us to explore these kinds of places. I could say that part of my childhood was like living in a Legend of Zelda game. I have lots of stories about those times, but this is the only one that I recall where we actually found something supernatural. Everything started pretty much as normal. Bunch of kids on their bikes, passing through hills and big fields. We knew how far was too far for us. After all, there were no houses or roads ahead, and once you turn around and you can barely see the house behind, then you knew you were just too far. But that day we felt bold. We were many, and we wanted to see what was ahead, so we did. After taking a while riding, we ended up in the middle of nowhere with no water, starting to feel the infamous Mexican heat. So we decided to go back. After a while, we saw a small house in the distance. Pretty weird, we thought, since we were pretty much in nowhere land, but we still felt relieved. We headed in the house's direction to ask for some water. But the more we got close, the more obvious it got. It wasn't a house, it was a tomb. Those big ones that resemble small houses. And that place was a really small pantheon in the middle of nowhere. Basically, it's a really humble Mexican graveyard with wooden crosses in really dry land. This was an extremely small pantheon with no roads leading to it, with only a couple of tombs. The biggest being the one we saw. We got curious when we got there. We also knew we would never get another chance like this. Usually pantheones are for the families of the deceased. If we ever try to enter another pantheon, we would get kicked out for sure, since a group of kids would have no business there. So finding one far away from any adults was an exciting event for us, since we had a place for ourselves. We entered the place, and started looking at the graves, the names, the dates. They were pretty old. After a little while we got to one particular grave. This one took our breath away. It had a dog skeleton perfectly assembled on top of the tomb, extended as if the dog was hugging the spot. The bones were dry, no blood in sight, except for black and yellowish stains on the bones. Next to the bones were a lot of black candles, bottles with a lot of liquid. Don't ask me what liquid, 12-year-old me didn't want to find out. And a lot of really crazy symbols marked on the tomb. We immediately knew that was witchcraft. But we were kids and we didn't get scared at that sort of stuff. Not gonna lie, growing up in Mexico makes you pretty tough. I'm the kind of guy who will not even flinch at the Six Flags Halloween haunted houses in Anaheim. I even laugh from time to time by walking through them. So after a while of talking and making fun of the grave, it got dark. It was a bit late, so we started to pack our things to go back home. When we headed to our bikes, we heard something like a whisper. I don't remember exactly what it said, since it was both soft and fast, but definitely there. It was coming from the tomb with the dog, from time to time. I first thought one of my friends was trying to scare us. It wasn't weird, even I've done it before. So I did the most logical thing. I started counting my friends to find out who was missing in the crowd, since that fucker was for sure gonna be the one I was gonna find hiding next to the tomb, or so I thought. I remember I counted and we were all there. I thought I messed up while counting, so I counted again. Nope, we were all there, so I thought, fuck, it's gonna be a junkie trying to sneak up on us. So I went to see the tomb one last time, sticks and stones in hand, but no. There was nothing in there. At that moment it was almost dark and we were freaked out. That's when I heard one of my friends say, "Hey, did you all see the hole in the back of the grave?" We all looked at the back of the grave, and I bet they shit their pants just as much as I did. There was a hole big enough to stick your hand in right there. I got close and looked inside, and I went pale. There were bones inside of the hole, not your usual chicken bones, no. Big bones. That's when I felt a cold wind coming from inside of the hole. And I knew it was there because it even got some dirt up in the air from its way out. My buddies saw it too, and they were the first ones to run. I didn't want to be alone here, so as soon as I heard them run, I got up and started running too. We never went back. I heard from one of them that the entire area where the Pantheon was located was turned into houses just like ours. Since I was a kid, I've always been really lucky with being stalked or visited by spirits. Some of the time I don't really recall, since according to my parents it started when I was 3. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 153. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Reddit user with no face, who was the author of the final story. That was the Witchcraft Mexico story, the spooky one in the old graveyard. Exciting times here at Casa de Hellfreezer. I'm altering the living room. I've had this silver and glass table, which is essentially just an excuse for me to put junk on it that I mean to move and sort at a later date that never gets done. So what I did is the other night, I finally got around to sorting it, and I did have this a CD player and a hi-fi thing on it. Just a CD player, like 3 CDs and a twin cassette player. It was my dad's. So it gives you an idea of, and he passed away in 2005, so it gives you an idea of just how long it's been there. My mother used it, and she passed away in 2008, and I don't use it. I've got no use for it, so it has been sitting there, unused, for 11 years, almost 12 years. So I was saying, well, there's not really any reason. It's not broken, it's perfectly functional. But I don't need it. That's not how I listen to music. I tend to use my computer and MP3s and that, or if I'm using a CD, I'll play it through the computer. For me, that works better. So I was thinking, I could get rid of that. So I'm going to move them. I'm not going to throw them away, but I'm going to move them up into one of the spare rooms. And I've been through and I've sorted a load of junk I did have there, and most of that actually got chucked out, which was a good thing, because I've been meaning to do it. Just bits and bobs, I occasionally repaired like computers and things once in a while. Not on anywhere near a professional level, just certainly an enthusiastic amateur. And essentially just what I can unplug and plug in as a spare part. I'll try to avoid soldering if I can avoid it. So I had a little bits and bobs left over from the last time I was doing that, and really that I didn't need to keep. A couple of phones that I'd tried to repair as well. So I just went, you know what, this has to go. So that got all chucked out, so the living room's looking a lot tidier, and I'll need to find some sort of a nice but not too old but not too modern looking set of shelves that I can put there, so that I can put my DVDs, CDs and books on it. It will also give me an excuse to actually start buying more books as well, which is good. Okay, and with that I'm going to head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening. And take very good care of yourselves.